Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining this podcast. My name is Dr. Irvin Scott, and I'd like to welcome you to Office Hours with Doc. Over the past 30 years, I, like many before me and many after, have devoted my life to America's children and its communities by working within the education ecosystem. In other words, I'm an educator. I've been a teacher. I've been a principal. I've been a district leader. I've been a nonprofit director. I've been a foundation executive. But so many before me have done those jobs, and so many people are doing those jobs, and so many people will do those jobs in the future. However, what we want to do in this podcast is look at individuals and listen to those individuals who are doing those jobs right now in order to do three things. One, we want to hear their stories, understand how they got to where they are, and what they're doing while they're there on behalf of America's children. And let's go beyond America, the world's children, because we have international perspectives that we'll be sharing. So that's the first thing. Number two, we want to better understand how these educators work within the ecosystem, not only as individual actors, because sometimes you have to do that, but more importantly, as team members to have impact. And then number three, speaking of impact, our goal is to hear how we might all work to accelerate our collective effort and impact going forward. These are the voices from the ecosystem that we'll hear in this podcast. If you've ever wondered what's going on in schools or school systems or school districts or however you think about schools in the US and the world and the lives of those individuals who are shaping children's lives, if you've ever wondered that, this is the podcast for you. Office Hours with Doc. Welcome. So it's great to see everyone. Actually, I really can't see you, but hopefully you can see me or you can at least hear me. Welcome to Office Hours with Doc. This was an inspiration that in many ways, this podcast was inspired by students of mine in different programs at Harvard Graduate School of Education. One big inspiration came from the online education leadership program. Students are all over the world. They're all over the US, doing work on the ground, having an impact within what I call the pre-K-12 education ecosystem. And one of the goals of this podcast is to just be in conversation with some of those individuals who are working throughout the ecosystem to understand their story, to understand the impact that they're trying to have, to understand how they think about the education ecosystem, and any other words of inspiration as they do this work on the ground. My ultimate goal is to enable individuals who are doing similar work to hear ideas and be inspired by these individuals. But I also think it's tremendously beneficial for those of you who may not be in the education sector, but have children in education, in schools, or have relatives who are in schools, or are interested in what's going on in schools. That's particularly as we come up to an election year, for example, this year. Schools and schooling have a lot to do with how things go in our country, in our communities, ultimately in our world. So I just love hearing back from people who are doing the work on the ground. I am excited to have my friend and colleague and a member of the Harvard Graduate School of Education Online Education Leadership Program, Dustin Baindridge, with me. And Dustin, thank you so much for joining us. We're really, really excited to have you. And I'll give you an opportunity to introduce yourself and just say hello to what could be anywhere from 1,000 to 100,000 or one listener. Welcome, Dustin. Great to have you.
Awesome. Well, Dr. Scott, always a pleasure. I just wanted to say thanks for including me on this new venture that's going on here. This has been an incredible experience. I started Harvard Graduate School the same week I sold my company in the EdTech space. So think about the emotions, the excitement, the role of what I just accomplished and completed, which was very difficult to do, and then starting this, and it's been this evolution of how do I create programming and support models for educators in the field that essentially have impact on students, because that's my biggest thing is as I've never thought about implementing wide scale solutions around money. It's been more around students, and it's never failed that if you drive outcomes around students, and it'll lead to obviously big business from there.
Mm.
My background is I was first generation in terms of going to college. It's kind of the running norm with our friends and our families. And one of the things that I saw early on was there was a big dichotomy between the haves and the have-nots, and we often kind of come to play around what resources are available for kids that have money and opportunity. And then, like myself, growing up with a single father who worked 7 days a week, what opportunities existed, which were on my own.
Mm.
So I've really thought about education as being a means to opportunity, and it's always been around that case. And so, grew up in Southern California, and for the past 3 years have been in beautiful Knoxville, Tennessee. And I will say that I've enjoyed every bit of it, except for the 10 inches of snow we got last week, because
Yeah.
I was not prepared.
Not used to that.
Yeah, so just yeah, that's a little background about myself there.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Southern California, born and raised, spent time now currently in Knoxville, Tennessee. Before we jump into talking little bit about the education stuff, what are some of the differences you see between those two places in any way you want to answer that question? I'm just curious.
Um, it's a great question.
Walk carefully though. Go ahead.
So just to give you even more of a drilled down context, I came the last 10 years I lived in a little community called Laguna Beach. And so it was a haven for it felt like I was on vacation for 10 years
Mm.
in theory, because the worst the weather got was 68, the best it got was 72, and there was never a cloud in the sky. Coming here to Knoxville, one of the beautiful things is you have seasons, but I mean, I'm not used to 14-degree weather. I mean, when I moved out here, I think I had one pair of pants and the rest of it were shorts and flip-flops. So I definitely, one thing I had to do was rearrange and get new apparel to make sure that I fit in well, because I was the guy walking down the street in Knoxville in shorts, and people would drive by looking at me when it was 29 degrees out. I'd say the weather, and then obviously one of the things I miss most about Southern California is the food. The food was just plentiful. I'm big on cultural foods. I love Indian food. I love Ethiopian food. I love all types of foods. But in Knoxville, we get an assortment, but it's not as plentiful there.
But you do get some Southern food in Knoxville.
We get some Southern food, but I also realize there was more portion control in Southern California. Here, I'm just like, it comes out, and I'm like, whoa, kids, we got dinner for like 4 days because the portion sizes are so big.
Oh, that's awesome. That's awesome. Listen, let's jump a little bit into your work in the education ecosystem. You talked about selling a company before coming to the program. Can you shed a little more light on what that company was? What were you trying? Here's the way we'll ask it the way I ask in class. What problem were you trying to solve with that company? And who were your customers?
Awesome. Well, I'll take you through the evolution of that in an abbreviated form to kind of give some context behind it, because it for me, everything has been around adaptability. My experience in education has been around the privatized test preparation industry, the
Mm.
Princeton Reviews, the Kaplans, and really coming into the Harvard program. I felt in the beginning kind of this mentality of this imposter syndrome, because there are obviously educators in the space who had been living and breathing the day to day. But one of the things that fascinated me early on in this kind of preparation space was how are these resources that these kids, these affluent kids with resources, not how do we bring them into public schools and do it in
Mm,
a way where public funds are spent on this, title funds, grant funding. And one of the things I got me fascinated early on was this whole kind of interwoven approach to what College Board and ACT are doing at the state level. Because we often read news articles, just on one on the Wall Street Journal front page today around the SAT
hmm
and ACT. Um, we hear that colleges are test optional, test blind, but early on, I started seeing that these big players, College Board and ACT, were getting these big state contracts. And right now, to date, there are 30 US states that mandate and pay for high school students as an EOC or end of course assessment to take
hmm
these tests, and it's part of a graduation requirement. And to see these privatized nonprofits infiltrating public education is fascinating, scary as heck.
hmm
And one of the things I started realizing is what resources for school teachers, administrators, students, families are available to look at these summative tests, but do it in a formative way. And there
mm,
really isn't anything. Kids take this test, they get the results a couple months later, and that's it. And if your parents had the opportunity to afford these resources, awesome. So what I decided to do was um, create a formative, starting with a formative benchmarking solution that modeled and mirrored the actual PSAT and SAT portfolios, as well as the pre-ACT and ACT, and do
mm,
it in a way that model the College Board, that model the ACT, and be able to provide this to school districts throughout the country because there was nothing available. I mean,
right.
when you think about the cool formative assessment tools in the space, you think of the NWA map assessments, you think of the iReady assessments. Those are like great K through 8
hmm hmm
model resources. But what's for high schools? Nothing. High schools are traditionally data poor, so this was a need. And when I went and visited districts, I asked, I was understanding what the needs were, and they're just high schools just didn't have stuff. And so by designing this model, it allowed for kids to get exposure to the test early on.
mm,
It allowed teachers to have immediate data. The data flowed into their student information system so they could use my data. The data we had is more of a multiple measures component. And this was just done as a fun thing with me and a couple buddies that turned into supporting millions of students throughout the country and giving data to districts like Detroit Community School District, like working with big schools within Chicago, working
mm.
with all of New York City Department of Education, and giving these resources and filling that void in the high school space. And so what we were able to do, and it was always a labor of love, but to seed, I remember, and I'll close on this. I remember sitting in my garage with my wife, and I'm like, babe, we supported 300 kids this quarter. Like, this is so cool. We did that. I mean, and I looked at the data yesterday, and I think this past quarter there was like 3.7 million kids that went through the platform.
Wow.
To see the growth of that, it was just it's the thing that drives me to want to make a difference and just to see numbers. So I'm very in the field, understanding what superintendents are doing, how they're leveraging data, how the data feeds back to the state, all that kind of stuff there.
That's
So
awesome. What a
yeah,
powerful story. And just to break it down for everyone, basically, when what you developed was a way, and correct me if I'm wrong, for students to practice and get better at taking the SAT and PSAT and the ACT, right? That's what you mean by formative assessments as a
correct.
tool. Okay. And then teachers could use that to support them and help them and so forth and so on.
Absolutely.
And so that's phenomenal. As a former teacher who used to teach, I actually had, when I was a high school English teacher, I taught students how to practice the SAT, right? And so it wasn't a formalized program in the sense that it was like you've created something that they could actually attest that you could spread. It was just a class that I developed, and it was a night class, and students took that class. And so, and many did better on the SAT as a result of taking that class. And what you basically did was created a tool, created a system, battery of assessments that would allow individuals across this country to practice those assessments, those tests.
Yeah, and it was done. It was done once the districts would treat this like the state test, and they would give their assessments. We had an entire nationwide teaching and learning team that would come in, and whether it be the next day or the next day, they have professional development set aside, and we walk them through the aspects around assessment literacy, like what is this test?
Mm,
Sadly, but also surprisingly, that with all the changes, because the SAT just changed again. Now it's a section adaptive testing, a test that's all digital. Teachers need support around what's just on the test. And then once you get through that, how do I disaggregate this data and understand it? And then from there, how do I use the data to crosswalk to what I'm teaching in the classroom from a way that
mhm.
I'm not reshaping or restructuring my curriculum, but just it'll help me teach with more intentionality. And so with this whole wraparound support model, that was a big driver for our retention year over year. Because if teachers felt supported, if they're getting immediate data, and kids in rural Yuma, Arizona, who
Mm.
didn't have never seen these resources, who were expected to do well in the ACT spring of their junior year, now they have this system of support, and it just became growing and growing from there.
And if I'm hearing you correctly, this was an equity play. I know a lot of people are moving away from that notion of equity, but how did you see this as an equity play?
And I think as an equity play, I mean, we looked at as our starting point was providing resources to districts that represented students in areas where they couldn't access these resources just based on geographic location,
Mhm.
financial resources. And so what we were focusing on there was how do we support all students and then being able to leverage that data to be able to look at different subgroups. How do we improve areas of different subgroups and ethnicities and what students who are mandated to take these tests in specific states who are on 504 IEPs, like how do we take all students and build a personalized plan? And then what we eventually did is we had a whole kind of tier one curriculum that we mapped out where we used to we take the data and then we would map out specific we would scaffold lesson plans and
Mhm.
build scope and sequences through the platform for if we had an art teacher who was doing SAT support during an advisory period, this was all structured in a way that made
Beautiful.
it very digestible for you to have structure in class, so all kids within the school site got access to this, not the ones who were overperforming, not the ones who were underperforming, but everybody, and building out a really specialized programming that met the needs of all kids.
Yeah. And we know in this country that there's a real difference in who gets that kind of support, oftentimes based on the income of parents, based on parents' knowledge and accessibility to various resources, and making sure that the students have access to those resources and those support resources so that they can perform better on these assessments. And so big time equity play and just creating more accessibility across so many differences. You mentioned economic, you mentioned regional differences. The other thing I wanted to elevate was the fact that the way you described it, it wasn't just oftentimes people see Kaplan, and maybe Kaplan is, I don't know. I'm not as knowledgeable around Kaplan, but sometimes people see these resources as just test prep, right? Just an opportunity for students to practice tests over and over till they get better. What I hear different about the way you built uh, these tools and these services, they were also professional development for teachers, right? Which goes way beyond test prep and actually provides support for teachers to actually teach skills that support students, not just in improving tests, but just improving their knowledge and skills around academic outcomes. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yeah, and you're absolutely correct. And I think, there was really two markets entry points into the market. There was the privatized test prep, and those words historically have a negative connotation. And one of the things we looked at is how do we collectively adhere to what the state's requiring? I mean, like for example, Illinois, Arizona, they require in high school three benchmark tests to track or use as a progress monitoring solution, and there really aren't a lot of resources. And so we have districts trying to pull map assessments or I-ready assessments into high school, which just isn't driving outcomes on these SAT or ACT. And so absolutely as a starting point was how do we build a true community partnership with schools? And the biggest effect that I used to always say, and I always say it still to today when we talk with customers, is the cultural aspect. We often think about these high stakes tests our junior year. In most cases, when these kids sit down their junior year, the foundation has been set. I mean, catching these kids early on, making the process very digestible, making it in a way that you're completely separating curriculum aligned instruction and norm reference test and not having those intertwined along the way. It allows for more of a cultural shift where kids, by the time they get to their junior year, they're coming more from a position of strength. They're not
Mhm.
coming from a place where, oh my gosh, like the stresses are so high for me. They're able to sit down. Now it's always going to be nerve-wracking for them, and I would expect nothing less, but it's not going to be as bad because I
Mhm.
feel at least more prepared for it. And so from the student lens, access and opportunity; from the educator lens, just knowledge is power and being able to really give them the tools they need to make some informed decisions and tie those back to their strategic goals.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Let me ask what I hope is not too controversial, but I'd love to get your perspective. And I'm not sure if I gave you a heads up on this question, but Dustin, you're
Oh, I
brilliant.
like these questions. Here we
You'll
go,
speak
Doc.
from the heart. I can imagine some educators out there wondering, okay, this guy sold a business. Was this a for-profit entity that he developed, or was this a nonprofit? And so that's sort of a yes or no question, or maybe you'll answer it the way you want to answer. And then the other question is, what if there are those out there who are like, I don't know about for-profit experiences happening that are ultimately supposed to support kids? How would you answer that question?
Yeah, I think with any so we were a still are the company is under different ownership, but it is a for profit. When you look at the kind of space that we were in, um, there really is for me in terms of starting the organization, it was more about me driving my passion, driving my goals, setting expectations that I wanted to set to have complete control of
Mhm.
the money that I put in and investments put into this. It wasn't ever designed like, hey, we're going to do this and we're going to sell this and do this. This was like, hey, I've had what we call quote unquote real jobs, and when I started this, it was like, hey, I want to be able to make big change and effectiveness. I think not-for-profits are great. I think that obviously there's in some aspects there's a little more your hands are tied at times in terms of a lot more policy and regulation around resources and where you can spend those resources. And so the decision was specifically around having my vision and control being able to navigate those waters without kind of having so many things being able to tie off because I do have friends who have non-for-profits where they want to make sizable differences and there's different layers and advocacy policies that they have to go through before they can start that type of work.
Mhm.
Sometimes there's a little bit more flexibility in being able to make more scalable, sizable differences from what I've seen, not all the time. And plus, enabled in going out to the reason I sold my company, it was purely around impact. I mean, obviously there's financial gains for all this stuff, but a lot of that stuff is, my wife and I are able to donate to other charities and do great things that we've
Mhm.
never thought we'd be able to do. But I'm still involved with the organization because I wanted to see our parent company that bought us were in 7,000 schools.
Mhm.
They had an easy access point to be able to turn on the faucet and allow us to get into their thousands of schools that they're in and make more of an impact. And that's just to be able to have the ability to see overnight millions of students flip on a switch and get started getting to work on this and access was just it was the vision. And I'm still here. I'm still driving. I'm the president of the organization and still getting to see the impact. I'm still in front of the customer on a day-to-day basis because that was part of the thing is I don't want you take me out in front of the customer, I'm out of here. So it's been great. But as far as that, it was more just navigating around less policy that I had to deal with in the beginning versus a non-for-profit. And I know with non-for-profits taking some classes here at Harvard, there's the ability for Jim Honen's class, we were talking around, a lot of it's raising money,
Yeah.
keeping that going. And I knew that that would probably infiltrate my passion, my mindset in the beginning if I went down that route.
Yeah. Let me ask you this real quick question. If there are listeners out there who are wondering, well, they're entrepreneurial in spirit, they have a great idea, they're really passionate, they want to have dynamic impact, and they're trying to decide whether to go for profit or not for profit, nonprofit. What advice would you give them to sort of think about in relationship to making that decision?
It's a great question. I think if going down the path of a nonprofit, a lot of the things I'd start working around is building a very, very sound board of experts who can help you define what your vision, what your mission is, um, understanding the bringing a supportive model in, whether it be a board member or a partner around the ability to raise capital, because it's going to be a big portion of what you do. Anything and everything you do in this space, also having a very sound financials, because that's going to be a big stake for this. So getting those foundations set first before you even really enter the market is going to be the key players. So three things. One, build a sound board in the beginning that's going to allow you to structure what your vision is. Number two, building a foundation around financials, because any money that comes in, it's going to be tracked by all means. Same for profit, but it's going to be a lot more scrutinized because the federal government looks at nonprofits quite a bit different than for-profit
Mm,
companies in terms of taxation purposes.
mhm,
And then from there, a lot of it is just selling your vision to everyone. There has to be, you're selling yourself, you're selling your vision, you're doing that to potential philanthropic organizations who are going to give you money. So there's a lot
mm,
more. You're selling your vision to people who are going to keep the lights on and keep you growing from there. On the flip side, on the for-profit side, there's still getting that financial foundation set. Uh,
mhm,
but there's a much more, let's go to market, let's get the product set up,
mm,
let's get this in front of users right now.
mm.
um, our goal right here is to get people buying the product.
Yeah.
That's what we need right now, because that cuts out the layer of, I got to raise all this money to hire a team, and then we can start we can start finalizing the product. This allows us to obviously um, build more of a scalable product sooner, and make more of an impact, I think, from there. And there's a lot less regulation on some of that, depending where you're at, but just some feedback on there.
Oh, that's really good. I hope people heard the distinction, right? So nonprofit, let's build, let's build the board, let's build the backers, let's build the support of human capital support. For profit, let's build a model that we can sell and get it out there and see if people are going to buy it. So that is one big distinction that individuals might look at as they are trying to decide which one to go with, right? So I'm looking at our time. This has been phenomenal. Two questions. I'll just throw them out there. If someone were to ask you in this next iteration of the work you're trying to do, what impact are you trying to have? That's one question. And then just any thoughts about where you think you are in the education ecosystem, both where this work was that the business that you sold, where was that in the education ecosystem? And how do you think about the ecosystem? You learned about the ecosystem with me, both the work that you've done and maybe work that you do going forward. How do you think about the ecosystem and relationship? So impact when
So just like everything going through this process, um, I say, so it took me from, when I say it took me from start to finish, little over 9 years to build something up and sell it off. And I will say the first 5 years, it was like you were in the middle of the ocean with giant waves, with no oars and no life vest, and you're just like, oh my gosh, I got to make it to land, and I don't know if I'm going to make it or not. And I could tell you, there must have been 3 or 4 dozen times I'm like, I just got to close this down. This is eating too much capital. Like, my wife and I, we sold our house, we sold our cars just to make things go. And I mean, this was this was, we're getting ready to move in back in with the parents of our, I mean, it was as bad as you would get. And every time I should have turned against this, but driving towards that mission of where I knew I wanted to be, maybe it was stupidity, but it worked out. But I look at the next venture and phase of where I want to go. And the thing that fascinates me, and I'm doing a lot of research on, is there is so much data in the ecosystem within, for example, student information systems. We have the
Mm,
power schools, the Aries, the infinite campuses that house every bit of data on students. And what it is it's a data vault. And what I'm looking at is how can we leverage and I try not to use the buzzword, but how do we create adaptive models using AI where it makes decision making for educators much faster, much more efficient. So
mm,
they're trying to not look at data spreadsheets, whether you're the chief academic officer or the director of assessment and research. Like if I need to have this data and I need to understand the why behind this. For example, in California, why are my A through G college readiness rates at 84%? And what do I need to do to get them to 95%? And being able to leverage the data that exists there to give you immediate feedback on that. And that's one of the things that I've been very enticed with in looking at wink wink. And so as far as kind of next steps, as far as the education ecosystem, when we were taking your class and looking through this, it was one of the main things that I kind of saw myself kind of floating around in different areas. But I obviously the business slash corporation was really what I was looking at as a starting point. But then I started seeing myself and kind of split between two other areas. Like policy and advocacy, because at these when we're in the current role, we're dealing with a lot of state departments around summative tests and of course assessments.
mm.
How are they leveraging this data to create accountability? Districts have to grow a certain rate. How are these tests showing that? So it was always around how are we manipulating what the state wants? Because, for example, North Carolina's college readiness score basically said in 2020, all students to be college and career ready had to get a 17 on the ACT. And in 2021, we're in the heat of the pandemic. They said, you know what? Let's move it to a 19. So a lot of this policy changes the way educators look at this data. And then last but not least, looking at the research and evaluation organization, because we are evaluating data on there. So those three kind of intermixing behind that educational ecosystem got me thinking through where's my impact going to lie. And so,
That's powerful. And of course, the pre-K-12, you've been there. That's where the teachers and that's where the students are that ultimately will handle or pick up these tools, use them, and be impacted. But I love the way you're thinking about your work floating. I hope you guys heard that. He talked about the corporations and businesses. I think that is a world that we don't think deliberately enough about. Um, and but you very much lived in that space, but also policy and advocacy because that shapes the environment in which these assessments are actually given, and then the research and evaluation, which is obviously what you're trying to ultimately be able to account for, and that is outcomes. Are students growing? Are they getting better? Are their skills improving? Are they accomplishing outcomes? So hard to ignore those three. Yeah, go
yeah.
ahead.
And then the last thing I'll just say that's been something that I've learned along the way, and I learned this early on because I was young and dumb, and as my father would say, I signed up for this Toastmasters organization, and I'm like, what is this Toastmasters? And they teach you. I thought it was an organization around public speaking, and it is. But one of the things I learned most through that was the ability to listen. And educators often, when they love to communicate. Most of the time, it's probably not on the best terms with parents who are upset, but the educators love to communicate. And there are a lot of disconnected, disjointed issues, platforms, curriculum, so forth. But to listen to them and find where those gaps exist, and
Mm,
just creating a product, a solution, whatever that may be for some of those gaps. That's where it all starts. I mean, that's where the thing is, because as you know, in the field, and you served many years as a public educator, and on both sides, and there are things that you look back like, why can't we do this more efficiently? And we say that every year. Why can't we do this more efficiently? Why can't we have this that'll help bypass this? Why are we in 6 different systems? Just taking the time to listen and figure that out and having the wherewithal to be able to think through and build something like that, that's what the impact you're going to make in terms of driving toward that.
Really appreciate that. That is a level of humility that I think is critical if you're actually going to build stuff that is usable, that people pick up and actually use. You can't just assume it's going to work. You have to get proximate. You have to be close to teachers. You have to be close to kids. You have to be close to principals and look at their world and build based on their feedback. And that's what I hear. That requires humility. No matter what sector you're, business, wherever you're coming from, that requires a lot of humility. Dustin, this has been amazing. I also appreciate your point around AI and all the data and leveraging that data in real time. Um, Perhaps with AI and other advancements in technology that allow us to serve kids much more effectively. Um, Listen, I saw you use a cup. Did it have
Yeah,
Taylor?
so my daughter, so there's a short but funny story. So my daughter's the opening weekend when they went to the concert, but then they wanted to go to the movie, which was basically the concert. And so
Uh-huh.
we dropped them off with like 6 of their friends, and I sat in the lobby. But my daughter was like so excited because they had a giant Taylor Swift cup and a giant popcorn bucket. And I swear they were the last girls because they wanted a late showing. It was like 8:30. They ran out of all of them. Devastated. So my wife had been calling multiple theaters and she found one like 2 weeks later and she went and got one set of them. And I use it as my drinking cup because it's like 64 ounces and I put water in it. And
Oh my goodness, that's
my
awesome.
daughter rolls her eyes. She gets so mad. She's like, "That's my cup." So it's been more of a conversational piece during Zoom meetings because it has Taylor Swift all over it. But as impressively, I can tell you all the albums that
Oh my goodness.
exist on here. I won't do it here, but she's made me. She says you can only drink out of this cup if you can tell me what each one of the album covers are. So I
Isn't
quickly,
that something?
yeah.
That in and of itself tells me you're a great dad. Way
Yeah,
to go,
I
Dustin.
try. And like I said, I'm a huge supporter of Taylor Swift because she's pretty phenomenal and not only as a singer but a businesswoman. So I'll continue supporting because
Yeah, absolutely.
them tickets
Hey,
aren't cheap.
I know. Let me ask you this. Has your daughter been turned on to football as a result of the Taylor Swift NFL phenomenon?
Yeah, so absolutely. So it's so funny because we were in the car and I wanted to see how deep this could go. So I was like, "Hey, who's Taylor Swift dating?" And she's like, "Travis Kelce." I was like, "Okay, let me see even further. What position?" She's like, "Tight end." I was like, "What's his
What?
number?" 87. Then I asked, "Who's his brother?" She's like, "Jason Kelce." I was like, "What's his number?" She's like, 62. And I was like, "Who's he play for?" The Eagles. I'm telling you, I was
It's
like,
crazy.
it's crazy. It's crazy. But
How old
I
is your
will.
daughter?
She's 13. I have one 13-year-old who's big into Taylor Swift and a 15-year-old. Yeah. My 15-year-old, a lot of this AI work that I'm doing with data sets and looking at stuff, she's up with me till 11 o'clock at night, and we're looking at different data sets. We're trying to understand
Wow.
if we're putting models together, what does AI do? And I was like, "Why are you doing all this?" She goes, "I want to go to Harvard." I'm like, "It's well, this may help you. This may separate you from the crowd. So if we can get something together that shows an impact of, she's like, all I want to do over the next 3 years is go to school, and she's doing well, and I want to pay for my own education. And if I can do
Mm,
that by leveraging a business and helping out with that, and work on the weekends and do sales presentations with you," I was like, awesome. So
she's on her way. Oh, that's awesome. That is beautiful. Listen, thank you, my friend. As this podcast grows, which it will, you're
oh
the only
yes,
second person. We'll have you come back when the second venture is up and running, and we'll talk about that.
absolutely. Well,
All
thank you so
right.
much, Dr. Scott. You've been an inspiration through all the work I've done, and I felt like you've always been there to listen and provide responses and suggestions and encouragements through all this stuff. And sadly, the 2 years went by pretty quick, but it's been great
Thank you, my friend. It's a joy to have you.
as well.
Take care.
Here.